continue through your procedure bylaw. So if you feel that certain types of bylaws should have first and second reading at one meeting, let's take some time to go back and then a month later to make sure, then you establish that. But I think having those resolutions that if you read a first, second, third time and finally pass, that I think is historical. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so have to ask a lawyer for the historic side of that. But in current day, it's, you get to decide.
And I guess to further your point, that first, second, and third is historical, just like they say, your worship. It's something that has always bothered me because I'm not someone to worship, but it is just, it is something that has become ingrained as the
quality that carries.
It carries forward, yeah.
Yep.
And again, just on that public consultation, if we want something beyond the ability to have them come back after viewing a meeting with feedback. If I'm having a debate about something and we say, well, the public might not like that. Well, I think they might not mind that. And we're trying to figure it out. What is the most common, effective, small scale public consultation that you can say, okay, let's launch this and look for feedback or guidance from the.
Yeah.
Do people actually do that?
Some do. Yeah, put out surveys on their website. They will invite people to come in. Don't forget that at the end of the day, the 5 of you were elected to represent the public and make the decisions. Doesn't matter what Jane Doe wants. They're gonna, and as Sarah said below, I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. That was probably, it's not really what I meant. Because they're obviously gonna consider, regardless of what Jane Doe says, you're elected to make those decisions and represent. And as Sarah indicated before, you might have 10, 15 people coming to you with 15 different opinions. Your job is to come to the meeting, to evaluate and consider all of the information that the public may have shared with you, as well as the advice and recommendations that staff are providing you, and you make the best decision that you feel is the best interest of the municipality.
That's an excellent point.
You're the one who was elected to do that.
Otherwise, you're governing by public opinion poll.
Yeah, and you know, it is important to engage the public. It is important to consider their opinions about matters, obviously. But again, at the end of the day, you cannot do that on every matter that's put before you on a council agenda.
And you are going to get opposing views on exact issues.
Yeah.
And it's your job to look at which decision will be the best for the municipality as a whole, not for Michael over here and John over here, who each have different opinions. What's going to serve your community as a whole?
That's tricky.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But you're the one who's accountable to the public to make those decisions, right? And you take in all of that information, but you're the only one at the table when it comes time to cast your vote. That's your vote.
That's probably tricky when you're adopting like socially friendly policy where say, hey, there's some people behind the taxes, let's get a ratepayer support fund to help bring them on side over time. Well, that could be messy. Some people who pay their taxes on time would be like, I'm not interested in that. So I think sometimes the social policies where you want to help the community as a whole by helping the stragglers who are struggling, because you could be a straggler next month due to something happening. So.
And that's where you put a policy. The policies comes back to policies, where if you have a policy, that is going to help guide council's decision-making when issues come up. It's also openness and transparency to the public about how you're going to make decisions when they come up. So again, it comes back to those important policies.
And other acts that might exist.
And we're gonna get into legislation later. Let's get Sarah.
I was just going to.
You know, I'm just gonna keep on talking.
Okay, so I just want to briefly go over we've done the first 2 roles, the policymaking role, and the representative role. And so now just really quickly, the stewardship role. So council's job is to ensure financial and administrative resources are used efficiently. But what I want to sort of clarify, I guess, and I think it's important to note is that there's a fine line between council's overall stewardship of the municipality, right? So again, you're working at sort of more that strategic direction level, And the administration's day-to-day management of operations that ensure the financial and administrative health of the municipality and that there be resources used efficiently. So you again do that through use of things like policies. You adopt policies that are then implemented by the staff. So you're not necessarily checking over the line by line items on the budget, for instance, but you've adopted a policy or policies that say this is how funds are to be spent. We will not be taking out significant loans or significant spending in this way. Your policy dictates how those things come together, right? So I just wanted to make sure that we made that distinction.
So does this mean that we shouldn't be looking at how many staples are bought each week?
Yeah, I would say that will make for long meetings, very long meetings, so. So staff are there to administer the programs as council intended. And so again, that sort of report back mechanism with staff becomes very important because they can say to you, they report back quarterly or they report monthly on certain key parts of municipal business. They can give you an indicator of whether or not that's being implemented as you, as a group, have intended that issue to be managed by the municipal staff. So that's sort of the distinction in terms of your stewardship role, that it's not necessarily, again, counting the staples as the example was given, but ensuring that, you know, staples are being used appropriately, or they're made available, and that they're contributing to efficient work being done at the municipality. So that makes sense?
Absolutely.
Any other questions on that one, or? I think we've pretty much covered it in our earlier discussion, so I am going to skim past it to keep us a bit on time. There's a second slide that does, you know, you guys all have the slide deck, so you can sort of read over these in greater detail. I'll skim them quickly, but so as a council, your stewardship role involves defining the objectives and setting the goals and the priorities. So that strategic level guidance for staff to implement administrative practices, get things done. You're going to provide specific guidelines, often in the form of policies and directions to staff on how you expect your, you know, the work to get done. You're going to delegate appropriate responsibilities to staff. You're going to establish a personnel management policy. So one of your jobs as a steward is to ensure that your senior municipal staff are doing the work that they were supposed to be doing, right? So you do have a bit of oversight there. So you're going to establish personnel policies that help to guide how that work gets done. Developing a communications protocol to be sure that you're all staying within those distinct roles as well. Yeah, we're good there. We've covered a lot of that in our earlier conversation. Quickly, we'll also go over the role of staff. So municipality can appoint a CAO or a chief administrative officer under section 229. It sets out the role there. They're responsible for exercising general control of the management of the affairs of the municipality. So they are your sort of chief administrator. They are the person that the information funnels to, as we were speaking to earlier. They take that information and they consolidate it for things like your agendas, usually to help build the way that council will address some of the issues that come before it. They're responsible for the day-to-day management of the municipal staff. So they may have department heads who report to them, who provide them information on how certain services that your municipality offers are functioning. They may develop internal processes to allow for, you know, how does that public works superintendent, how do they report how things are going in the public works department? So the CAO would be responsible for developing those sort of internal mechanisms and processes to funnel the information that would ultimately go up to council for its policy level decisions.
Are those defined as policies as well?
The
way that the information comes up from the road superintendent to the CAO to the, is that a policy CAO?
It's a procedure.
Well, it would kind of probably fall within your job descriptions.
Yeah.
So the
Right.
job description is going to say that the public works director reports to the CAO, the
Right.
clerk reports to the CAO, treasurer reports. So it's that high, like, think of it like an organization chart.
Right.
Right.
Sure, yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
so you're gonna have council at the top. And the part I like to, unless you were gonna cover it, Sarah, but the part I like to cover is picture an hourglass. So you got the top triangle, You got a bottom triangle, in the middle, there's a hole, sand filters through. So sand, think of that as information. Top triangle is council, bottom triangle is staff, that hole in the middle, sand flows through, that's your CAO.
There you go, Donna.
And when you turn it over,
Decision to buy.
when you turn it over, so it's the flow of information, right? So staff will flow information to council through the CAO. Council's gonna flow information to staff through the CAO.
Right.
Picture an hourglass when you're thinking about that. And Sarah, I believe, mentioned on the previous slide about communication protocols. So again, that's still all part of it, right? So establish those protocols so that again, the public knows how things are gonna happen and staff and council knows how things are gonna happen.
Any questions? You good? Okay, so moving us along, look at us, we're moving quickly now. Yeah, I got control again. Council staff roles, so there, municipality does have statutory officers that you should be aware of. So the act sets out certain officers, employees of the municipality that have special considerations for their role. So their roles are meant to, I guess, directly deal with certain issues outside of the role of council's influence. But people like the chief building official. So chief building official has certain pieces of legislation. They have delegated authority under those pieces of legislation that they are responsible for. And so they are, in a sense, independent in those particular areas of decision making from council. So they manage those responsibilities on their own. Council is responsible for appointing those people, though, to be in those positions, right? So another example would be the fire chief. The fire chief has certain pieces of legislation that guide how they maintain fire service in your community and fire protection. But council would appoint a fire chief as part of their role.
Sorry, do have a question. Part of your org chart, of course, is gonna show where these people report to, and of course, the clerk and treasurer are gonna be reporting to the CAO. Is there limitations as to how that fire chief has to report in an org chart, or is it up to council to decide that? Like, in other words, would the fire chief report to the CAO, and the CAO report to the, okay,
Typically, yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
And there may be parts of the fire chief's role where they have to actually report to the fire marshal, but there may be elements of their role that in those statutory, those legislative obligations, they have specific roles that direct how they report on certain things.
so same with CBO, they would report
Yep.
directly to the CAO, right?
Yep.
I think historically in this township, council members were directly involved with running of the administrative day-to-day things, which now is a culture change
Yes.
that we're working towards. It's happening, but
Yeah. It never should have been that way.
right,
Municipalities have been in existence for a long time and the stuff that we're here talking to you about today is still processes that were in existence for a long period of time, right?
you have to read this,
Yeah, and, attend training and, it's all part of trying to, helping you better understand the roles. And that's where I think a lot of times, a lot of our smaller municipalities in, the 70s, 60s, that's kind of how they operated. They had a committee for everything and the committee of, the fire committee felt that they were the department head of the fire department. Well, that's not the case. They're not the department head. We'll get into committees, talk about committees later, but yeah, it's important, especially in that system where, they're the head of administration.
So the council is responsible under legislation for making sure there is a clerk, a
Yeah.
treasurer, and fire chief at CBO. But they can still be appointed by the CAO in all, no?
Not appointed, so council would appoint the clerk, right? You would pass a resolution that says, Donna is, or sorry, bylaw, I screwed up. They would pass a bylaw that says that Donna is the clerk. And Donna maybe that's about the treasurer, we'll say the treasurer, you're all three.
So you could do clerk, CEO, treasurer, and then I would decide with your blessing to hire a deputy clerk, a deputy clerk, a
Yeah,
deputy
yeah.
treasurer.
And because it says the municipality may have a deputy clerk, because it's a statutory position, the CAO would have the authority to hire staff under her, but she would bring that to council and say, I need a council bylaw to officially appoint this individual as a deputy clerk or as a, deputy treasurer. The hiring of a CBO, the hiring of other department heads, council needs to decide, and it's probably through job descriptions, as to who has delegated authority to make, to hiring of department heads. So typically, like you may say that it's the CAO along with a committee of council, where it's one or two other members. Because you usually don't want just one individual on a selection committee, right? For certain positions. So you would decide through HR policies on who has that delegated authority, but the actual physical appointment of people to these statutory positions is done by council bylaw.
Okay, and all the other positions don't have to involve council at all if we so choose. I mean, I know
Yes.
in neighboring councils, anybody who's hired full-time has to be approved by council. But we can make it so that if a road superintendent or roads workers hired, they're hired by the CAO.
And we're gonna,
And we're not going to be involved in that hiring
Yeah.
process.
and we're gonna get into that with delegation of authority.
Okay, sorry. Again.
Very good questions.
Sorry.
In interacting with these positions, fire chief, CBO, treasurer, clerk, what are my limitations as a counselor? Example, a ratepayer reaches out to me and says, CBO has contacted me versus infractions, and I'm confused. Can that be something that I can talk to him about officially, talk to the CBO or am I offside meddling with the CBO role? Or can that then kind of instead come to a council meeting? Just wondering how, as counselors, we can not get in the middle, but like shine a light on an interaction between one of those roles and a rate in a specific situation. My question makes sense.
Do you want,
And if this is coming up after,
no, this one's a tricky situation because you don't want to be perceived as directing the CBO to do something in contravention of the Building Code Act, right? Again, I would look back to your policies. Is it somebody filing a complaint about that CBO? Well, then there's a proper process you probably already have. If it's you want to understand more information about that, what I would do about that situation is I would send an email to the CAO who that CBO reports to and express that you've received a call and then you would like more information about that to better understand what the ratepayers' concerns are. And before you even direct that person to file a complaint, because maybe they do have a legitimate complaint, maybe they were harassed or, but you want to find out information. I would go through my CAO and say, I have this concern, can you gather me more information? She's not gonna have the information, but she's then gonna talk to the CBO and maybe set up a meeting for you or get him to write up a report that can be sent to council. It may not have to go on a council agenda, or they may provide you with, just a little bit of information. I always say give it to all the council member because no one council member should have more than another. So in that case, then, send an email to you and by the way, I'm CCing council so that they have the same information and they're aware of the issue. And then if you feel that it deserves or that there is a legitimate concern, then have that conversation with the CBO or with the CAO because that individual likely reports directly to the CAO. And if it's an HR issue, well, then that's the CAO that needs to deal with that. So I don't know if that helps.
I'm thinking like in this case, if someone's in infraction, a ratepayers in contravention of zoning
Building
or
code, yeah.
building a code. And maybe if the process runs on its own accord, unchecked, maybe he will be evicted from the township at the end of the day. That's happened historically, it has happened. Maybe we don't want that as the final outcome. Maybe we want the opportunity to change the direction So that we, we're not booting people out of our,
You can't direct the CBO. If the CBO finds an infraction, a building code infraction, the CBO is obligated. There are statutory obligations under the Building Code Act that a CBO and building inspectors must follow. And there is a presentation that the other arm of our ministry has with respect to building inspectors and building code. And if you are interested in that, I highly recommend that Sarah can provide the information on who you can contact. I highly recommend it. There's a fine line where you don't want to be perceived as direct in the CBO because there could be personal
Impact.
impacts from a legal perspective on an individual council member who does that, where you may not be protected. So you could find yourself in a personal liable situation, right? So building code, fire code, those are clear pieces of legislation and statutory obligations or statutory responsibilities of individuals who are appointed to certain positions. No different from a clerk and a treasurer. When the Municipal Act says the clerk shall or the treasurer shall, council can't interfere with those statutory obligations. You may not think that that's the right thing to do, but unfortunately you can't override the provincial legislation.
difference, the huge difference, I think, between interfering and gathering information to potentially offer a different path that.
Well,
maybe
and that's
some
where
of the
you should have the conversation through the CAO, because again, having the conversation through the CAO, because maybe you think that CBO or the fire chief was maybe overstepping their authority a little bit under the building code. Maybe,
Not
that's
even,
where-
but just the
but that's-
policy and the circumstances.
but the policies the municipality adopts cannot override provincial legislation. We're gonna get into that a little bit later. But again, I would always bring it back to your CAO because that person reports. And depending on what you find out, it could potentially result in maybe, an HR issue where, or something that comes back to council that says, we would like more reports from the CBO. Right? It could be that, you know what, we weren't made aware of this in a timely fashion, or we would like to be made aware. Not that you're going to interfere, like you said, but you would like to be aware because, given the heads up, we do that. Coming out here today, we've given a heads up to our, senior management and other individuals that we were up here speaking with council and training. So it could be like in your situation where you wanna. That's not necessarily contravening the act, but you may have the authority to ask for more reports, more heads up, more information. So but again, I think you gotta go through the scale for that.
And I think, sorry if I could just, there's a clear distinction in the act as well around not actually performing work that a municipal staff person would perform, but I think is important to note, right? So your role is clearly set out. So we said you have a stewardship role, you have a policy making role, and you have a representative role, right? But on individual issues, a particular constituent or a particular person in the community, individual issues with an individual or a distinct policy or a distinct service, typically that would fall to staff. And in this case, it sounds like it's a statutory officer. So there's that extra complication of can't even as council, let alone a single councillor, direct a statutory officer on any of their obligations. But generally, even if it wasn't a statutory officer, you're going to want to steer clear of performing duties that are not yours to perform as a member of a council, because the act specifically states that you cannot be a staff member to sit in your seat.
And because you're ineligible of being an employee at the same time, you ceased,
You could cease to.
you could cease to be eligible to sit on council. So because you can't be a member.
Yeah, I'm falling under representation in this type, it'd be
Yeah.
representation.
Yeah, so as long as it's,
Representation.
but as long as it's at that strategic policy type level where you're looking for more information to influence that,
Better understand.
the council's role in it. I just offer that as a caution that sometimes I think the lines get a little bit blurred when you're trying to help, a local, a specific constituent with a specific issue. If it's not at that policy level, I think it just is a point that does come up often. That question often specifically.
I just did one comment, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
you mentioned that you should let the other counselors know about this information. I would think that good advice would be to make sure that they did that by blind carbon copy emails and not by ordinary emails, because you certainly don't want to have a conversation.
You gotta
back
be
and forth.
careful, yes,
So
definitely.
if you're letting anybody else in council know what you're doing, it should all be by blind carbon copy with no reply.
But the members should know that that is one way, or the other way is, this is for your information only, please do not respond.
Put that at the top of your.
Put that in response, put that in the email. If council would like to discuss this, I can put it on the council agenda kind of thing, right?
Right,
Yeah, you raise a good point. You should be careful, but every council member should be privy to the same information. So, send it out.
send out the information, but don't send it out as.
Don't start having a conversation in an email.
I need to carry this one much forward because I know the situation that John's speaking of. It's a real situation. Is it that counselor's role to disagree with something, a decision that CBO's made in a statutory obligation to inform council that somebody is about to be evicted because they haven't followed, and we should try to stop this?
Well, they may not be able to stop it. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is council has a right to know certain things, and they have a right to ask any staff or department for reports on what's happening in their department. They have the right to ask that because that's part of your stewardship role.
Yeah.
Is to keep an eye on what's going on in the municipality. Where that fine line is asking for information and then trying to interfere and prevent the CBO from performing his or her statutory obligations under the legislation. So that's the fine line. There's nothing wrong with asking for the information because you want to know, and then saying, well, you know what, council, I think we need to be made aware of these in a more timely manner so that we're given the heads up, and when somebody comes to talk to us, then we could say, if you have an issue, come to council, because they can still come to council. But you need to know as a council where your authority begins and ends. And with building controls, and fire and other statutory obligations, your authority will end at a certain point in time. And you have to be able to accept that. And you have to be able to explain that to the public. But again, it's that conversation about buildings is best to have with the other arm of our ministry.
As an example, we could use the police. I know we don't have a police force here in the city, but if we had our own private police force, we couldn't dictate what laws they followed and what laws they didn't. I mean, no one would even suppose that they could go to the police chief and say, I don't want this person arrested because I don't think it's morally right. You have a police department, and it would be the same thing with the CBO or the fire chief.
Yeah.
I don't want the fire chief to respond to calls, or I want them to do this particular service. They're dictated by that act.
And so I'm conflicted because in this particular situation, when John did ask for the detail, the CBO said, I am not allowed to release that private, taking it to your police information about that particular case. But what I can say is that because that was the case, he said, I'm not allowed to share that particular detail with any member of the public, even if they are council members.
But they can assign like I think we talked about there, or maybe some municipalities, I like to use taxes. Staff, the treasurer has the authority to tax sale of property unless otherwise directed by council not to, or is not to, unless otherwise so directed by council. So you might say, well, we're only gonna tax sale after 3 years instead of 2. But the act clearly gives the treasurer the authority to tax sale. So that's a legislative process. Council can't interfere with that. They can't, and the name of the individual and how much they owe is protected under a FIPA. So council shouldn't be knowing how much I owe in taxes. So if I'm gonna be tax sale, but what we recommend and suggest to the treasurer is that the treasurer provide a report that assigns me a unique identifying number. And there's not, I don't think, and this is probably a question for our buildings branch, but it may not be an issue for the CBO to provide a report to council that says property A, and they're not giving any identifier to tell you where the property is or who the person is. But here's to give you the heads up so that, you know, in the event somebody does come to you, then you know you need to go speak to this person so you don't step in it as well, right? Is protecting you, but to give you some information about an issue that could be coming and making headlines, right? Where that I think is common courtesy, but that's probably a question for the buildings branch that's part of our ministry, is what can they specifically provide in order to give council enough information so that council feels comfortable, not with them, not supposed to do their job, but to have the heads up.
Even just to manage the impact of that.
Yeah.
Or the political impact of a decision that, you know, may come as or the outcome that comes from the CBO's decision on this particular property or particular issue. It's maybe a courtesy heads up to say, this is how the act says I must act in this way, and this is what is coming your way. Maybe it's as simple as that, and maybe it isn't something that council specifically can control that one individual instance, but maybe a policy, like Kathy was saying, to
Give you the heads up.
to give you the heads up, or to, in the future, this is how we as a community want to plan to deal with these things. So
Because it could be too, that you build that into a report that says on a quarterly basis, council wants to know how many building permits were issued, the dollar value. Well, then as part of that too, then it could be, how many orders have you issued? Yeah. Right? Not so, you're not giving away the farm saying I've issued 5 orders this month to comply. You're not.
Or to who?
yeah,
You're not saying to who, you're just saying I've issued 5 orders to comply with respect to not contravention of the building code
and then what does
over
that
this
information,
period.
what does that information do for you as a council? Okay, we clearly have an issue if we have so many building code infractions.
Yeah.
We have to work as a council, to develop policies and directions for
Public
building
information about.
Yeah,
Yep, so it's
Is it
a
feasible?
broader than that one particular instance.
if he's issuing five orders every quarter or 10 orders every order, you maybe now have an issue with people not complying with the building code in your municipality. Well, maybe then it's where council can look at that from an education and training perspective. You know what? Let's have some information, information
People know.
sessions on the requirements of the building code.
People know what the
That's where
standards
your
are
work
comes
comes
in.
in,
Do they
right?
know the risks of maybe fire implications of the building?
Yeah.
Like, do they know the risks, do they know the resources that are available to support, to have a good handle on the issue as a whole? I think that's probably more likely.
And then maybe it's-
something
yeah.
like that.
And in your next newsletter, it's, you know what, we're gonna put in there, did you know about fire safety? Or did you know that, or you might wanna proclaim that, July is building safety month. Just to get the word out there about the requirements. So that's kind of where your role comes into play, not so much administering the building code.
Right, so that's that stewardship of like, I'm gonna bring that information to everybody equally, so that we,
If in a population of 600, you're getting 2 evictions because of back tax, I think that it's a small enough community that we should be made aware of that issue. And I think someone's privacy, they should have the option to forfeit their privacy to find a solution before they're actually kicked out of their house.
They do though. There are many warnings that go through
Sometimes
taxpayers before.
Sometimes a warning is not, like, sometimes some cool heads.
Legislation.
They have 2 years to pay, and if they're not paying, the other, well, we'll get that tax collection is a whole other section, we can do another presentation.
Because it's risky to get involved at a personal level because you can be manipulated.
Yep.
Without knowing all the facts. That's why it needs to go through the person. who's
And again,
responsible.
good policy so that everybody is being treated consistently and fairly.
and there's a clear pathway for issues when they do
Yes.
come up.
Yeah.
A clear pathway is through the CAO, maybe in your community or their pathway is, you get to establish.
Because on a personal level, I can say, well, that's your problem, but somebody else who's more compassionate.
Right.
Might get more involved in it.
Yeah. Okay, so.
It is also risky, I think not. I think it's risky in a small community to just
But
let people get the boot and say, well, that's too bad.
we operate as a corporation, which is a body or a council. We're basically one. We act as one person.
Let's go back to section 224 of the Municipal Act, which says that councils, that's head of council, sorry. Council's job is to ensure, so one of them, ensure accountability and transparency of the operations of the municipality, including the activities of senior management. The next one, the main important point, maintain the financial integrity of the municipality. So if you want to give people an opportunity not to pay their taxes, or sorry, if you want to just say, we're not ever going to collect, if that's your policy, or if that's what you want, you better make sure that's in a policy so that staff know we're not going to collect, but you better be prepared for the consequences. Because what's going to happen is if people are not paying their taxes, you're going to end up with an increase in interest charges because you're not getting the money in on a regular basis. So now staff can't pay bills. They can't pay themselves. They can't do, anything that you put into the budget, they're not going to be able to do because the cash isn't coming in. And then you're going to have the people who are paying, they're going to be coming and saying, well, you've now increased my taxes because we're now being charged extra for interest charges because you have to borrow to meet your current needs. That's not fair to me because I am paying. So council can adopt whatever policy they want, but you need to understand the consequences for the decisions that are made. So that is where you have staff prepare a good report that outlines the consequences and, repercussions and all of the considerations for that intended policy. And then, or again, a report back on, well, you know what, okay, we stopped collecting. And at the end of this year, the interest that we now have to, on the borrowing that we have to do, is resulting in a 2% tax increase. Now, you're the one who has to justify that to the public, right? So these are, it's fine to put the policies in place or, think about certain individuals in your community. But again, when you come to the table, you have to factor in the impacts of the entire community as a whole. So I just want to bring that, it's the financial integrity of the municipality that, and to factor in.
So I think through the examples and through previous slides, we've looked at what specific roles are, right? So council has a certain role, the councillor has a certain role, the head of council has a certain role, the staff have particular defined roles. And I think this is a very important next slide. So how do those two halves, or like Catherine was saying with the hourglass, like how do those two halves interact, and how critically important is that to the municipality? And my answer is very, very important. So it's an important part, council staff relations is an important part of how you're going to work together to get the good work of your municipality done. So some councils establish programs that require employee input put into operational policies and procedures that recognize staff's experience and expertise. Staff traditionally are those operational experts or those leads. They prepare reports and recommendations for consideration of council, and council typically makes the strategic and governance level decisions based on the information that staff provides to them. The relationship between them is interconnected, so you are constantly playing sort of that back and forth battle of that we've highlighted a lot of examples of like whose role is what, and at what point does my role stop and this person's role start. And so your policies help to guide a lot of that work, but it's critically important that you, I guess, depending on whatever role you have in the municipality, that you are respectful of the role of somebody else and what they bring to that equation, and that those distinct roles, they work together intentionally to create those checks and balances so that an individual councillor does not find themselves in a particularly risky position, or a staff member that they're offsetting their different roles that are balancing together to create the good and efficient work of a municipality. That be anything? Yep. No. Okay. Okay, strategic planning.
Uh,
Oh. Deep breaths before we get through this slide. Okay. It's considered to be an essential part of municipal governance. The process that you use to define a strategy or direction and make decisions about how you're going to allocate resources, your financial staff resources. The strategic plan can help council develop strategies, goals, objectives, and action plans to get to a new place with a particular issue, to reach a new desired outcome. They're meant to be forward thinking and proactive, not so much what you're doing today, but sort of where you want to be head to in the future. And it can guide your decision making and project planning and budgeting. A lot of municipalities will use strategic planning tools like a SWOT. It would identify their strengths, their weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And once you adopt a strategic plan, you're going to want to be sure that you're measuring that and that you're reviewing it periodically. Skip by. Succession planning. Also important is succession planning. So it can be carried out to ensure that when key personnel leave, and I know that most municipalities that I work with have had significant turnover in staff and even in some cases members of council, that the municipality can continue to deliver. Like, what are the things that you have in place that you can continue to deliver your necessary programs and services with minimal disruption? Like, what are you putting in place in the event that your CAO finds a new place to work or has reached the end of their career? Maybe your treasurer is moving on. What's in place to help carry that good work forward? Hopefully to spend tons of time on that. Your succession plan can give you time, I guess, to adjust or to plan for when those. You might see that your CAO or somebody who's been with the municipality for quite a long time is looking at retirement in the next 5 years. Of what are you doing now to ensure that the knowledge doesn't leave when they walk out the door?
And that's a key point that Sarah just made there. It's the knowledge transfer. So don't just think about, the things that are in place here or thinking about something needs to be replaced. Think about how you're going to get that information out of that person's head. Sarah mentioned about, somebody retiring in 5 years. You may not have 5 years to think about or to plan. So think about the systems you can put in place to ensure that the information that is in your staff's head is put onto paper and stored, right? I like to talk about the public works director that we had for 40 years, and he retired. And I mean, that guy could talk to you, and we had nothing on paper because this was back in, he was there in, early 1900s kind of thing. He didn't like to put things on paper, but he had everything in his head. He knew where culverts were. He knew when things were changed, but he didn't have a very good way of documenting anything. So that is still should be considered as part of succession planning. So when somebody leaves, and if they leave suddenly, can somebody new come in and take over? So think about that. I recommend thinking about that as part of succession planning. It's that knowledge transfer from that person into writing.
I don't know if you know this, Kathy, but in let's say November of 2022, we had no staff and no politicians at all carry over, and we had no information given to anybody. So everybody, essentially, except for some non-statutory officers, we did still have roads, but the rest was all new. And I'm sure everyone here appreciates the importance of not leaving anybody else in that situation.
Document. It takes time, but it's an important piece.
I think if you've lived that experience as well, I think other municipalities I work with have also lived that experience. They can sort of attest to it being far more costly and far more difficult to path to rebuild policies where they maybe weren't there before, weren't left. There's a lot of work that goes into to trying to collect as much of that knowledge retroactively, right? So.
Especially when you get to the part on the fiscal training at the end.
It's a good record.
We only had I said we had no statutory officers. We did have a clerk. But again, it was what, 3 months and then back in again, so. Yeah, it was tough for the staff here. The
The
staff
history here has been,
dramatic.
and policies haven't been in place or followed.
Or directions.
We're
I
in
mean,
repair mode.
Right.
When repair-
At that time, we were reactive. But labor policies weren't followed.
Right.
Human rights policies weren't followed, so.
And the trouble,
We're past that. but
Yes.
It's now repair mode.
It's
Well,
repair.
it's, how do you set it now?
It's
How do you set
repair.
this right going forward, right? You can't
Yeah.
change that.
You can't change the
You
past.
can't, and you can't live there forever. You know, you're here now. How do you move that forward so that in the future, when staff choose for whatever reason to maybe leave positions or when, you know, a new direction, strategic direction happens and you're planning differently, how do you have things in place to transfer that information?
And I wonder, like, this is another subject, but in that knowledge transfer, we also just came out of a pandemic. So when you're not working, together and share that information verbally, you don't have the tools that you would normally have working in, that is also part of that disconnect.
Yeah, probably the gap, right? And that,
Yeah.
you know, if we have that down somewhere, if we don't have the plan clear and identified for everybody, then, you know,
Yeah.
something like, you know, having to work from home for an extended period of time, that might disrupt a lot more than it should or could.
yes,
And I recently took a course for records management, and it was all about the digital platform and being prepared for the next pandemic, not if, but when. And so what plans do you have in place as your municipality to be prepared? Because the next one would be not like what we've experienced before and could be worse. So how do you prepare your municipality with all of that in place, your positions, your directions, your organizational charts, and still function remotely?
And it's having the technology in place to be able to do that. It's having the procedures in place. That's not, council doesn't write the processes and procedures. You approve the policies, but you also have a stewardship role in ensuring that staff are putting the processes in place in order for them to, ensure business continuity. So thinking about it as business continuity.
And I think just so that everyone knows, because you all know that this is the exact situation that both Teresa and I walked into. No written anything. It was all in people's heads and they are all now gone. And so to rebuild, as you said, we have had to rebuild with no knowledge, with no documents and with improper tools. When you talk about technology, we can't get a cell phone. We have old computers, we have old systems, and the tools come at a cost. So council also needs to, and this is not a criticism against this council, but councils also need to recognize that being able to function requires the proper tools that cost money, that will result in increase in, especially if you're not bringing in the funds that you should be bringing in order to help. It's only going to land in a tax increase, or that we're not able to function in the way that we ought to be. So we have started documenting. Everybody should know there's processes, everyone who's doing a job now, as we're discovering and rebuilding processes, these will be documented for the new people who come along.
Well, this is a really good example
Or next year.
of like the two halves working together, right? So when the procedures are clear, it enables council to carry out that stewardship role of ensuring that the procedures are in place. Like, you have that communication back and forth between the staff and council to ensure that those things that they are aware of, maybe a gap, and okay, we need to ensure that we're allocating enough resources to this particular area because it needs to get done. So that's a perfect example of how the two halves work together to ensure that you don't end up in that situation again, where there's no roadmap for the next team that comes in, whether that's the next council, certain council that gets elected, or whether or not that's new staff.
And it involves a lot of times, most times, in my experience here, change that people aren't always willing to accept either. So practice in this community, because there's so few people, doesn't matter how many they are, is you just call and make the complaint to anyone. But we don't want to put that in writing. You don't want to formally say it. Well, now you have to formally provide the complaint so that we can deal with it. So it
Can we
can be
get the
logged, so
report
they can be reported on, so they can be tracked. It's not about, well, don't tell anyone, but I have this complaint. Well, what would you like me to do with that then?
Well, it's also reinforcing the individual and the unique roles that go into that work together, right? So the more that you have those clear pathways for people, the more that council can focus on their stewardship role in appropriate ways. They can focus on their policymaking role in appropriate ways. They're not bogged down with those issues that, put them in a position that may be uncomfortable or inappropriate, and vice versa. Like it reinforces those roles, right?
And if I may, there is one other issue, and I really feel sorry for the members of council, myself included at a time, is that in our roles, we are to bring stuff to staff to have them do the research that then we bring forth as a resolution, et cetera, et cetera. We realize, and I'm sure everyone in the council realizes, how overworked our staff is in trying to correct things, and as you say, in damage mode. And let's just say I had the idea that I wanted to do a certain project. Communications, hydro delivery, or whatever. I know that staff just doesn't have the time for me to now say, well, listen, Donna, what I'd like you to do is prepare a report about hydro delivery systems in the township of Calvin. And get that report back to me so that we can discuss it in council, because what our CAO is going to say is, okay, so what part of the budgetary financial statement do you want me to ignore so that I can do this report for you?
And that's why council, though, as a whole, and when you're, as council as a whole, you're directing staff to take on certain work, but you're going to be choosing the most strategic projects to tackle first, and knowing that you've had, potentially a difficult time with turnover of staff and a difficult 2 years or so, challenging capacity issues because you just don't have people in seats or whatever, right? So from that perspective, there's a million things that you could be doing, and there's a million wonderful ideas, and a lot of times councils come in with lots of fresh energy, especially after an election. But
Right.
Your job in that sense of the steward is to use your strategic lens and look at it and say, what makes the most sense, and where does the staff have to spend their time?
Right.
And we're going to be mindful of how we direct the work ahead, right, for that.
Exactly.
And that's where Sarah talked about strategic planning. So at the beginning of a council term, if you do strategic planning, well, you know what? You're setting the strategic direction for the municipality that staff need to follow.
Okay, no, I
Right?
have a strategic plan question for you, and this is specific. This isn't just theoretical. We do have a strategic plan that was implemented by the previous council and goes to 2026. And I'm sorry, I'll say it publicly. I think it's the worst document I've ever seen as far as the strategic plan goes. So we need to change that. But again, that's going to involve a lot of time on staff's part.
And some of those things, if that is a priority for you, council can consider, you know what, let's hire a consultant. Because I know staff doesn't have time. So a consultant will guide that process for you. Obviously, it's gonna cost money, but at the end of the day, if that is a priority for you, then make it a priority in your budget, right? And that may
And that's
help
what I was going to.
where it's led by a consultant. And then that also helps staff. If this is, you need to set the strategic direction for the municipality, so then staff will know, okay, if council says, well, I would like you to do a report on hydro, and they're gonna go back, they're gonna look at, okay, my strategic plan said nothing about this. They're gonna come back, they're gonna write a report that says, and what I would do is, what a lot of municipalities do is, in their staff reports, they'll have a line item in there that says a linkage to strategic plan. And if the CAO comes back and says, there is no linkage, this was not a priority identified in the strategic plan, therefore we recommend that this be put on hold for 2 years.
Excellent.
That's bringing that back to council saying, you know what? council, you just asked me to do something that was outside of your own strategic direction, right?
And I was going to bring that point up, right? Strategic plan, by the way, is on your next agenda.
Yes.
So coincidentally, you brought that up. But that if there are issues and projects that council wants to carry out, and you're very cognizant of the fact that we're rebuilding and getting out of messes and dealing with that more than 70 emails a day in my case, then you do have the ability to say that through additional hiring, we
Yeah.
will make this happen. So that everything doesn't need to fall in the view that we have, but there's a consequence to getting things done outside of what needs to happen, the priority today.
Yeah, so, you know, we talked a lot about policy and putting things in writing, and as part of that policy process, staff should be telling council, explaining to council, what are the repercussions? What are the financial implications? What are the staffing resource implications of this policy that council wants to implement? Or, you know,
But like, it's part of the recommendation.
project you want to do.
Yeah, as part of the
Yeah.
recommendation, it should be a fulsome recommendation that has the risks and the potential rewards and,
Yeah.
you know, anticipated outcomes, and, you know, this is why we're saying yes, this, or these are 3 options to consider, and these are the, you know, the certain things you can expect if you choose those options.
Other things in staff reports too, where staff is bringing a report about maybe some equipment that needs repaired or replacing. What I would, what a lot of municipalities are doing now is they, in addition to a strategic plan line box in their staff report, they have a box for linkage to asset management plan. So again, an asset management plan, that's helping guiding council's capital decision making, right?
Mhm.
And you are required under regulation to have one. So what staff will do now is they will write in there, you know, here's the linkage to my asset management plan. My asset management plan says this should have been replaced 3 years ago. It is overdue, right? So they're linking it to you, showing that the decisions that they're coming to you for, or the matters that they're coming to you to make decisions on, link to other policies the municipality has already adopted. You've already said, this is what we're gonna do under asset management planning. This is what we're gonna do under strategic planning. So get staff to link it to the policies that you've already adopted so that you can show, look, we've already done this. We've already said this was what we were going to do. Again, they all help guide council's decision making as you go forward.
Thank you.
Well, quick check in, I know it's just after 12, is there, are we
Lunch
good
is
here?
here.
Did you want us to pause here, or do you want us to?
Yeah, lunch is getting cold, but they're.
Are we?
You want to work through lunch or should we
You have to.
take a half an hour? Whatever works for you guys.
We have quite a bit of material left to deliver, so we could work through lunch, we could have a quick.
And we do
Break.
kind of have a hard 2 o'clock, unfortunately.
Okay.
So why don't we take a 15 minutes and grab,
Yeah,
and then we'll come back, and I'm happy to keep.
Okay.
I can actually both feet if that's okay.